Now, let's bring in Strategic Analysis Australia Director Peter Jennings. Peter, thank you very much for joining me from Canberra. Look, I want to ask you about the conflict that we're seeing between Israel and the United States. The US President Joe Biden clearly walking away from commitments that he made to Israel to support it in its mission to destroy Hamas. Now, the US is very clearly, unequivocally calling for a ceasefire.
Yes, that's right, Shari. It's a very surprising and quick change. As far as one can judge, it seems to have more to do with Democrat calculations of the domestic political impact on the Muslim vote in a number of American states in the presidential election. It leaves Israel in a very difficult situation because, frankly, any immediate ceasefire now leaves Hamas to some degree intact, 4 battalions worth of fighters in Rafah in the south of Gaza. And I think, Israel will, regardless of what President Biden is asking for domestic political reasons, Israel is going to prosecute this conflict to achieve its war aim of destroying Hamas's military and political capability. And frankly, I support them in that objective.
Look, a lot of the media, including here in Australia, hold up the United Nations as some sacred body. But have a look at this. The Palestinian representative to the UN, Riyad Mansour, has described Hamas terrorists as brothers during an address after the UN passed its ceasefire vote. Have a look.
All of us are saying immediate ceasefire, and in fact, our brothers and sisters, Egypt, Qatar, are negotiating with the United States and others, and negotiating and mediating with our brothers, Hamas.
I mean, Peter, this doesn't give us much hope that the Palestinian Authority would be a better government of Gaza if they're calling Hamas brothers.
Well, brothers in the sense of Cain and Abel, Shari, would be how I'd describe it. I mean, let's remember that the Palestinian Authority is essentially the Fatah faction, which Hamas, when it consolidated its power over Gaza, happily killed, lynched them, shot them as they took over power in Gaza. A challenge for Israel here is, who do they negotiate with? Hamas is clearly a terrorist organisation and recognised that way by many states internationally, including Australia. The Palestinian Authority has regrettably sympathies towards terrorism and is now, I think we're seeing just a little hint of that in those comments in the United Nations. That's the tragedy for Palestinians, is that their representative bodies at the moment are groups of extremists who continue to want to call for the destruction of Israel. How does Israel attempt to negotiate a two-state solution with either of those groups?
I mean, it seems completely impossible, and they've just officially walked away from negotiations in Qatar, although there are reports that a small Mossad group remains to negotiate the release of the hostages. Peter, we've seen that France has now raised its terror threat level. Very concerning, of course, because the Olympics will be in Paris shortly. But why haven't we had the terror threat level raised in Australia? Clearly, there is a higher threat level since October 7. Anyone can see that. Why do you think the government hasn't done it?
I think having allowed the terror threat level to be reduced, which happened a number of months ago, the government sees this as a very difficult thing to do, to effectively let ASIO, which has the control over this issue, lift the terror threat level. And so what we've had from the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, is a pretty concerning speech saying that the risk of terrorism remains substantial in Australia. I agree with you. I think it can only be seen to have become more serious, a greater risk as a result of weekly protests, which is kind of almost endorsing the idea that extremism is somehow acceptable. This, I think, creates a period of great risk for the Albanese government, because what if something happens? What if there is an incident? That one couldn't rule that out. And yet very clearly right now, the government is taking a sort of a light-handed approach to managing these street protests, which I think is entirely the wrong strategy.
All right, Peter Jennings, thank you very much for joining me this evening.